Everything, episode 279. You're joined by just Fenian again. Knowlesy's not being lazy, it's just we kind of have conflicting schedules, and I just figured it would be easy for me to do this episode solo today. So, again, yeah, obviously we're doing this a bit late, and some of the content is slightly dated, only slightly. So anyway, the main reason, or the main topic for today was going to be about Angus Taylor's budget reply to what we've been told is one of the more controversial but also more ambitious budgets that have been handed down. But just before that, I did a rant on the prescription of White Australia last week. I'd like to just go on another one, but much, much smaller. And that is just to say that if you don't know, there has actually been a High Court challenge now that has been accepted. So what that means is there's an injunction hearing that happens in early June, which is, only a couple of weeks away. And that is to seek injunction for White Australia to not be proscribed so long as the High Court is hearing the case that it is unconstitutional for the federal government to actually proscribe the organisation, or indeed any other political organisations. And that hearing will be held in September. So, look, that is going to be monumental. So obviously, fingers crossed for the June hearing. And that would mean that, in the meantime, the government would be unable to throw people in jail. Remember, the maximum penalty is 15 years in jail. They would be unable to do so unless the High Court rules that the government has acted legally come September. Because, look, I have no doubt that they'll get at least one or two people, I mean, that's what they want to do. That's what these laws are there for. They want to throw us in jail. And the people that they get would probably not be guilty at all. But the government, as usual, would just make shit up. And because we have a very biased judiciary in this country, very good chance that, say, if it was just heard at a magistrate's court, particularly a magistrate's court in Victoria, well, they'd be locked up pretty quickly. But, if you've been following the court cases of various figures like Thomas Sewell, Joel Davis, etc., you might be familiar with the concept that basically in the Australian system, as you go to a higher and higher court, the fairer they become. And I'm not just talking about our guys. In fact, I'd say the best example would be George Pell. Remember, he was found guilty twice in Victorian courts. He then took his second appeal to the High Court, and unanimously they threw it out. And he was freed. So I'm not saying that the High Court is full of our guys. They're certainly not. And they've still made bad decisions. For example, the decision that even if you're of just a tiny, tiny bit of Aboriginal ancestry, you cannot be ruled an alien in Australia. Like, you have an automatic right to citizenship, even if you were never born here or never even been here. So, yes, the High Court is still paused in many ways. but they're so much fairer than, say, the Victorian courts. So much fairer. And even though I bet no one on the High Court would like Thomas Sewell or White Australia or the membership or anything like that, and they probably see the organisation as just completely abhorrent. I think, though, that they do take their duty to the court seriously. And remember, as a legal practitioner or a judicial officer, your number one duty is to the court, to the principles of justice. So even if you don't like the people whose fate is in your hands, you're still expected to be fair to them and apply the law as it is applicable. And the High Court is much more likely to do that than a lower court. And, that's why I say to people, don't worry, it's not over yet. Perhaps you could say this is a battle that we have lost temporarily, but it's absolutely not over. So, but look, on the other hand, if we are found that White Australia is going to be kept as a proscribed hate group, and that membership or support of any kind would result in jail time, well, you know what I think? I think people are going to start turning to political violence, because when you take legal avenues away from people to advocate for their political purpose, well, you're only leaving them with illegal means. The only way they can actually organize politically is by breaking the law. So when you do that, that might cause some people to think, well, you know what? If I'm going to break the law, I might as well break it properly. I might as well be more effective than what I otherwise could be. And that's a very dangerous position for any country to be in. All right. So let's move on to the budget reply, which many have called xenophobic, racist, anti-migrant, scapegoating migrants for all of the country's economic woes. It's also been seen as a pitch to One Nation voters that the coalition is scared that they are siphoning their traditional constituency. I do think it's the latter has some truth to it. And, there's some rhetoric in here, at least from Angus Taylor, that appears to be more on the side of a tough migration stance. But is there anything actually substantive to this? Well, let's examine that. So the coalition would seek to tie net overseas migration to the pace of home building. There would also be $5 billion for local infrastructure supporting new home construction, while at the same time they would scrap Labor's flagship housing programs. So he's also said that he's going to wind back the changes to negative gearing and the changes to the capital gains discount for investors. Now, first of all, how he's going to do that first one, I have no idea. What kind of bureaucratic maneuvers would you have to pull off to do something like that? Like looking at the data in terms of how many houses are available. I mean, look, it's a good idea, but I just don't see why we have to be told that this is all according to a particular plan, instead of just saying, no, okay, here's the maximum amount of people we'll take every year, right? And look, even if this were the case, like it was tied to the amount of available homes, it wouldn't be enough. I mean, like Nolsey and I have said many times that housing in Australia is already massively unaffordable to so many people. And there are so many people who are going to go to their graves never owning property, whereas if they had lived at another time in Australia, they would have been able to actually own their own home. So we're talking about people who are permanently locked out of the market now. So it's not enough for house prices to just stagnate or even fall a little. No, you need to crash the fucking market. You do. You need to send some boomers broke. You need to take a huge shit on property portfolios. You need to have a lot of investors go out on their ass. You absolutely need that, right? Now, yeah, that would be dirty. That would be pretty hard for a lot of people, but it would be a small amount of people, all right? We're talking about people who are from what you could basically say like is the aged aristocracy, or pretty close to it. But, think of the positives that would come out of that. Think of the amount of people who would then actually be able to break in to the market. People who are not investors, people who actually want to buy a house to raise a family in and to live in. They're the people I think that we should care the most about, not investors. Okay, now, Angus Taylor has also said that permanent residents who are not Australian citizens will not be targeted under any future potential coalition government. So he basically denied that, like, he was targeting non-citizens. But look, since then he said that I think it was something like there's 14 like forms of welfare that non-citizens would be ineligible for, and that includes permanent residents. So that's obviously, payments at Centrelink, but then they were also talking about things like certain things on Medicare and also the NDIS. Now, why a lot of people are saying this is unfair is because, well, two of our biggest migrant groups in Australia are the Chinese and, of course, the Indians. And if you seek citizenship in another country and you're Chinese or Indian, that's illegal in those countries. You can't hold dual citizenship. And there's actually quite a few countries who have that law, because, they don't want to reward dual loyalty. Actually, we do that for members of parliament. Can't be a dual citizen if you want to be a member of parliament. It's a way to combat dual loyalties. So it's, I don't actually really have a problem with it on the surface of it. But anyway, they would be ineligible. And it means that, like, we're in a situation where we've got all these people who from China and India who refuse to apply for citizenship because they want to remain a citizen of China or India. So that means all of them are going to have to make this terrible, terrible decision as to what they want. But look, if this actually encourages some of them to go back, well, great. Now, of course, you might say the opposite would happen. You would encourage more of them to take on citizenship in Australia and revoke the citizenship of their home country. Well, yeah, sure, that would happen. But would that really mean that they would be any more of a migrant in Australia? Would it mean that, they end up becoming further entrenched here than they otherwise would have? I don't think so. Many of them are perfectly happy just to live to the end of their days, basically, on permanent residency. They don't see a problem with that. There's plenty of people who do that. So yeah, I certainly, on the principle of it, I have nothing against that. They would also want to exclude non-citizens. We went through this in another episode, I think, of the government's home buying program, which was to the government to have a share in the equity, and that meant that as a first home buyer, you could buy a house with only a 5% deposit, and the government would kind of help you with the rest. So again, Angus Taylor is saying, all right, we want to exclude non-citizens from that one particular program. And yeah, the left is going absolutely ape shit over that. And I pointed out when we went through this originally that like just about every country in the world has massive restrictions against foreigners buying property, huge restrictions. We use the example of China that said that like if you're a foreigner, basically if you're just a non-citizen, you are completely excluded from being able to buy investment properties in China. You can buy one place for you to live, and that's it. And plenty of other countries are the same or similar. So, we're one of the few countries that doesn't look after its own citizens and puts the interests of foreigners and foreign investments ahead of its own people. Now, all right, so maybe you're thinking now, well, I must be very much in favor of some of these policies from Angus Taylor. Well, yeah, look, if I had to choose, yay or nay, like sure, I'd tick the boxes. But is it going to be enough? Well, I mean, excluding them from like one program like that, from like this one program that would only get like say a few hundred, a few thousand people into the housing market, that's a drop in the ocean. Why can't we just say no? As non-citizens, you cannot buy any property whatsoever. Why can't we do that? That's the way we should do it. Okay. So the coalition has also promised to reverse Labor's property tax changes and introduce a permanent system to index income tax brackets to inflation. So this is part of his plan against bracket creep. Bracket creep, of course, is when your income begins to fall into a higher tax bracket. And that can happen, say, due to, well, you just get a pay rise, but it also could be like, say, if you've done overtime work. Sometimes suddenly your wages push you into this higher bracket. You have a greater proportion of your wages taxed, and it leaves you kind of thinking, okay, why did I even bother working those overtime shifts? It wasn't worth it. So yeah, I mean, look, that is a genuine problem. And I have said before, our top income tax rate is 47%. That's nearly half your wages. I think that's far too high. I do actually agree with Tim Wilson in that one. So yeah, I mean, look, rather than have these like accountancy tricks that Angus Taylor wants to do, in this case, index income tax brackets to inflation, can't we just lower the thresholds? Can't we just lower the percentage rates in which we tax people? I can't really see why we can't just do that instead. Now, it's been estimated, this is coming from the ABC, that would cost $35 billion in the first 4 years, which is much more than what the Liberal Party suggested. So, they always do this. They always love accusing parties of the numbers not adding up. And they always disagree too, of course. So that cost, according to the ABC, would grow rapidly to $44 billion in 1 year alone in 2035 to 36. That would be both the cost to the federal budget and the cost would be imposed on taxpayers due to bracket creep in the absence of the policy. Many things here are kind of purely about disposable income. rather than the more important things like actually getting property prices down, rent prices down, power prices down. I think that they need to look at that a lot more. Um, oh yeah, so Jim Chalmers, many have called this like a boomer busting budget, uh, and some have actually gone even further, and they're trying to say like, no, look, this is actually like has cross generational consequences because young investors are affected by this as well. Um, and they've said that this would affect the buying strategy known as rent vesting. So, what rent vesting is, this is when, like you say, purchase a property in a suburb that you don't find all that nice, and you wouldn't really want to live there, but you buy this property because it's a developing area, and in a few years' time, it would be a suburb that you would want to live in, and therefore the price would go up. And at that point, you can either move in there or you can sell it at a profit. So when you buy it and you don't want to live there, what you do is you rent it out and you use that rent to rent a different property that's like closer to the city, that's in a nicer part of where you live. And the coalition and others are trying to say that this would discourage that. I'm not so sure. I mean, look, all that's happening here really is like, when when an investor sells their property, um, they're going to be subject to the same rate of capital gains tax that other investors are for selling off other assets like shares. I don't really see how that would affect something like this. I mean, for one thing, it would actually encourage people to stay in a house rather than sell it. Sometimes, they just kind of think, okay, well, the amount of capital gains tax I'm going to have to pay on this, maybe I'm actually better off holding on to the property or actually renting it out. And then you get more houses on the market to rent. And the more houses there are to rent, well, the lower the prices will be. But further to that, Jim Chalmers said that young people would still have the opportunity to utilize negative gearing to rent vest if they were to purchase a newly built home. So he said this: they can continue to do that for the home that they already own, and they continue to do that in the future for new builds, which would be very positive contribution that they would be making to our communities. Yeah, so look, you can still negatively gear um, the property if it's a new build, um, and it's your first house. So you can still do that. Remember, there are carve outs here. Negative gearing is not being abolished entirely, and the capital gains discount is not being abolished entirely either. I believe like farmers are exempt, for example. Um, okay, now something we didn't cover um, in our budget episode was that the government has announced nearly $40 million in a fund to overhaul aviation consumer rights. So that would include a new watchdog and complaints system that could lead to compensation for disrupted passengers. Um, Now, airlines, of course, are saying that these changes could drive up airfares, maybe. But, like there's a lot of dodgy things that airlines will do. Like, um, maybe you've heard that they sometimes purposely overbook flights. And the reason why they do that is because, on average, there's a few people who miss the flight. So there's usually a few empty seats on that flight. So the airliner thinks, okay, what if we overbook? And that way we can get the plane to greater capacity. and therefore obviously earn more money for that particular flight. Okay, but what happens if everyone turns up? What if everyone who has bought a ticket on this overbooked flight actually turns up? Well, obviously you have to turn people away and say, sorry, you're not getting this flight. That is bullshit. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. That's just one example. So, it's one of those areas where you feel like saying to them, well, look, if you don't want to be regulated, then maybe you should actually run your business properly. When you're doing dodgy shit like that, that's when people get angry and they call on the government to regulate you because you're not doing the right thing. Okay, now another response from the opposition regarding the budget is that they oppose the 30% tax rate on discretionary trusts. And one of the reasons is because that actually includes discretionary trusts that are established at death. They're otherwise known as testamentary trusts. So, yeah, that is what you would actually call a death tax. These trusts are established at a person's death, and then the government reaches in and takes 30% of it. Now, look, I do think that trusts should be fair game in terms of taxation. And remember, one of the reasons why we have trusts, or probably the biggest reason why we have trusts, is that it's basically a legal form of tax evasion. Putting your money away in trusts rather than off where it is, say, accumulating interest and you get taxed at a particular rate. Or if you're an investor and you've got it in shares, or if you've got it in property or anything like that, sometimes it actually just makes more sense to hold that money in trust, and you'll be subjected to lower tax rates. But yeah, the idea of actually taxing someone to death, and it's not like everyone who has a testamentary trust is like some high flyer. That's not true at all. Many of them are actually on fairly modest incomes. So I think I agree with the coalition on this particular one, but other forms of trust, no. Like, look, they've been using it to dodge taxes for decades in this country. So I think it's about time, really, that they went after them. Now, Paul Keating has backed Jim Chalmers' push for the removal of the 50% capital gains tax discount. And he also said that Labor should not budge on the carve-outs for startups or shares. Yeah, so that's part of the exemptions I was talking about. The 50% capital gains tax discount will not be abolished for startups and for shares, certain agricultural properties, things like that. And Labor love this when Keating comes out and makes these kind of declarations because, well, for one thing, don't think that just because he's a Labor man that he will, just like reflexively support whatever the Labor Party is doing or proposing. He won't. In fact, he's been quite critical. Kevin Rudd once said, I think he needs to get over the 96 election loss because he was criticizing some policy of his. So the other reason why is because, well, I guess over the long term, Paul Keating has basically become a Labor Party hero. And perhaps just as much for his time as Treasurer as his time as Prime Minister. He's seen to be the great economic reformer, the man who kind of set up Australia for the kind of prosperity you would soon see. And no doubt he certainly thinks that of himself. So Keating wrote an open letter in full support of the Albanese government's uh, removal of the 50% capital gains tax and also the ban on negative gearing for existing property. Um, so, interesting fact. I reckon Jim Chalmers would be absolutely gleeful at this because um, maybe you've heard to him referred to as Dr. Jim Chalmers. That's right, he is a doctor, but not in economics. A lot of people think that he's like a professor of economics. No, his PhD is actually in political science. And you know what his thesis was in? It was on the prime ministership of Paul Keating. That's right. Jim Chalmers has a PhD in Paul Keating, literally. So he must have been stoked over this. Okay, and look, just finally on the state of the economy, we are going to go through some of the other coalition policies and other sections of the show today, such as housing and migration. But just to finish off talking about the economy at large, the Reserve Bank Assistant Governor Sarah Hunter says that there are increasing concerns about rising price pressures in the economy. She said that if inflation expectations continue to build, policymakers could lose the ability to lower inflation without creating a recession. In other words, higher interest rates are on the way to curb rising inflation, and at the same time, we'll fall into a recession. Look, I mean, certainly in terms of a per capita recession, I mean, we've been there for decades now, you know. But things are actually going so bad with inflation and everything else that we may actually reach technical recession soon, possibly this year. And, you know, I don't think the Iran war is wrapping up anytime soon. Uh, I know Ryan Dawson is saying that it is likely going to kick off again this week. There's been a number of military deployments made to the Middle East. So, you know, all the signs are there. And the negotiations seem stalled. And it looks like this could actually go on for months. And the entire conflict may rack up a total of 1 year or so, all up. A lot of people thought this was going to be very short, and I think a lot of people have been surprised by it. And of course, so long as this war goes on, we're going to feel the economic consequences of it. Okay, now on to housing. So, talking about these key reforms here, the government says that, as I said before, it affects generational inequality. The idea that boomers have too much. Boomers are the haves and everyone else are the have nots, which we all know is true to an extent. They got to a situation where their disposable income was able to grow and grow and grow, while housing prices just kind of stayed where they had always been. And they were, many of them, able to buy multiple properties for peanuts. And they're benefiting from that now because they're the investment class. You know, I said before, like even my parents, who are definitely not like, you know, no one would consider them investment material, investor material, but even they own three properties, and they didn't really like start seriously saving till like their late 30s. Honestly, um, like my background was actually quite working class, and but as my parents got older, they sort of slowly became part of the middle class. I think is a good way of putting it. Um, but now the idea, you know, like if my parents were growing up now, if they were my age now, they'd be locked out of the market. They would never have been able to afford anything. Now, at the same time, though, young people are questioning whether these changes truly do work in their favor. For one thing, they're questioning the decision to grandfather the reform. In other words, it doesn't apply to existing properties. Okay. And that means then, well, hold on. That means that boomers who do have these properties are still subject to the old system that favors boomers. But new investors, those who don't own properties, are not. Now, this raises obviously a good point. Like, the current system is supposed to actually favor investors, and investors are the ones with all the money. But how can you actually bring young people into the investor class when they actually don't have that amount of money? Well, this is what the government is trying to say. Like, if they can somehow push down rent prices and property prices, that would give young people a better chance of breaking into the market. And it is that reform that would help them more than helping them out with things like a capital gains discount and negative gearing. The thing is, though, like, we wouldn't have to make decisions like this if we just targeted migration. If we just did that, if we were to lower the demand for housing, because it's clear we can't keep up with the supply. We can't do that. We bring in record amounts of people in all the time, and we supposedly do it to fill a skills shortage, yet the houses don't get built. The only way to actually stop any of this is to curb that demand that's there, that is making the housing market red hot and pushing prices to sky high levels. If we actually did that, then, we could keep all this negative gearing stuff and whatever. I'd be fine for that. At the same time, I don't mind abolishing this either, because I think it is. I don't like the idea of favoring investors, whether they're old or young. I don't really care. But yeah, I think it probably would be fairer if we made it so that it did apply to existing properties. It would be a lot easier than to say that this is truly tackling intergenerational inequality if we were to do so. So I'd say, like, all or nothing. Either keep these programs or abolish them entirely, and abolish them now and for everyone. That would be the best way. But again, like, it's all pretty inconsequential if you were to just slash the amount of migration that this country took. Now, at the same time, many first home buyers are saying that they are encouraged by the government's reform. And at the first Saturday auction since the federal budget was handed down, there was actually a surge in the amount of people who had turned up. And like, they profiled a few people in this article. Where's this coming from? From the ABC. Like, some people who had been out there for over a year bidding on properties, and now they're delighted they finally got some. And there's even talk of, like, some parts of Australia where housing prices have already come down a little bit. So that's interesting. But again, it's probably all just drop in the ocean stuff. Okay, so a mix of social, affordable, and private housing has been proposed for a 1,000 home development in Dowsing Point, which is in Hobart's north. So this is, they're going to be replacing the Derwent Barracks, which was previously property of the Australian Defence Force. And so that's being sold off. so they can have this 1,000 home development. Yeah, this is definitely not the first time we've done a story on one of these. The ADF has actually been selling off a lot of property lately. But again, how much of a difference is that going to make? Story from Mount Isa. So this woman named Kerry Major is facing homelessness after the not-for-profit she had been renting from stopped paying its bills. More than a dozen families in Mount Isa are at risk of sleeping rough after the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Corporation for Welfare Service racked up nearly $1 million in unpaid rates. Vacancy rates there are close to zero in the outback town that this woman is preparing to live in. Wow. Okay. This sounds like one of those like Aboriginal NGOs that it's mainly funded from government and maybe a few other places. That has basically wasted all the money, and now they have over nearly $1 million in unpaid bills. Obviously, there's a tipping point, and they have to shut down. Oh, when are we going to learn and just stop funding these places? They never work. Okay, now in Queensland, councils can sell off properties if rates and charges are at least 3 years overdue for residential homes and 1 year for commercial properties. So at Rockhampton Regional Council, they issued notice to intention to sell 30 properties for owners with outstanding money. 6 properties were presented at the auction. They were sold for a combined total of $1.128 million. Now, let me repeat that. 6 properties went for a combined total of $1.128 million. This is really cheap. Remember, that amount of money, that will not buy you a house, even a shit house, in Western Sydney. You won't be able to buy like just empty land. Remember, there was that that driveway somewhere in Sydney that went to developers. I think the total was $1.25 million that developers actually bought it for, and there was nothing on it but concrete and a shed. Whereas here, they say that there was one guy there who got a 3x1 house for $200,000. Now, that is a steal in today's market. And yes, I know it's in Rockhampton. It's a regional area, but so what? So many of the regional areas are unaffordable now as well. So, yeah, not bad. And the picture of the guy who bought this had a very, very happy look on his face. Okay. Over to Tasmania. So they have a new short stay accommodation dashboard that shows the number of dwellings used as primary and secondary short stay residency in the state. The number of whole homes that have been converted to short stay accommodation has increased by 498 since the end of 2024. New legislation to introduce 5% levy on short stay accommodation will be debated in Tasmania's parliamentary upper house. So, yeah, look, this is where they're trying to make it so that if you do have one of these short stay accommodation places, you need to be encouraged to rent it out more or pay a levy on it. Because, well, housing crisis, we don't like the idea of all these properties just staying there unattended. People are even talking about that in for holiday homes. Now, actually, that's our next story. So this is here in WA. So a new report shows short stay listings outnumber long-term rental listings 3-1 in Western Australia. The short-term accommodation sector says it cannot be blamed for a nationwide housing crisis. Well, they're right about that. They can't be blamed for that. A WA housing advocacy group is calling for a ban on new holiday homes in low vacancy areas. No, fuck that. So now they're saying, like, okay, like, because of the housing crisis, you're not even allowed to buy yourself a holiday home. Oh, for fuck's sake. Look, and like, this is another thing that, like, basically every fucking boomer has, you know? Like, even if you don't consider them to be investors, like, you know, so many of the people I grew up with, their parents had like one house in the suburbs in the metro area and one house, usually just a small place, by the way, nothing extravagant, some small place in some regional area, you know, holiday house. So in this new Australia, like, not only are you not allowed to have a fucking backyard anymore, they want to stick you into a fucking sardine container. They're even saying that, oh no, because of the unaffordability of this market, you're not even allowed to have a holiday house. So they want to put restrictions on that now. Now, this is the point we're at, where, again, we will not tackle the one issue that is causing all of this. And so we have to go after pissy fucking things like holiday houses. It's just fucking infuriating. Okay, over to New South Wales. So New South Wales Fair Trading has issued 12 fines totaling $50,000 and delivered 13 formal warnings to landlords caught wrongfully evicting their tenants. So yeah, they introduced these laws in May last year. So that's the ban on no grounds evictions. In other words, you know, just like when someone gets sacked from a job, you've actually got to give a reason why. And you have to give a valid reason as well. So in these cases, you know, they were found that there was no valid reason. The tenant was doing nothing wrong. You know, I'm assuming that, you know, they were still paying their rent, keeping the place in order, that kind of thing. And so one real estate agent has been fined $35,000 for evicting a tenant at a Campsie property on what later turned out to be false grounds. Wow, that's a big fine. So the total was $50,000, but only one of those agents got one for $35,000. That must have been serious. That is a massive fucking fine. Okay, still in New South Wales, the Auditor General has released a report into the state's Resilient Homes and Resilient Lands program. The $980 million disaster recovery programs were implemented in response to the 2022 floods across northern New South Wales. The audit assesses whether the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority is effectively administering the programs to meet their objectives. Yeah, so some of these places have just been declared that they're uninhabitable. We've covered before that there's actually a lot of squatters in northern New South Wales, in the regional areas, where you have homes that have effectively been condemned, you know, because they're considered to be in a danger that's just too dangerous for things like flooding. And so homeless people will gladly go and move into them. So the money is also used, you know, for repairs, but also rehousing, telling a lot of those people, look, you can't live here. And you know what? It's nothing to do with bloody climate change. It's just that there are actually many areas of Australia that, yeah, we need to admit they're uninhabitable. It's just like there's a lot of farming property out there where the environment is just not conducive to what they want to do for the crops that they want to grow. And it's not, again, not because of climate change. It's just, it's always been like that. But for so many of these areas, like, we don't want to bite the bullet and say, no, people shouldn't live here. People shouldn't farm here. The environment is just not right for that kind of thing. And it might be a tough decision, but, it needs to be made. All right, now, luxury apartment blocks and contentious residential projects are being fast-tracked, given approval in Melbourne under a scheme intended to boost affordable housing. So the program allows applicants to make a cash contribution to a social housing fund instead of delivering affordable homes. So yeah, what these developers do is they make, like, I don't know, whatever the minimum contribution is to this fund, this affordable social housing fund. And then they go and they construct luxury apartment buildings rather than social or affordable housing. Wow. It doesn't get much more ironic than that, I don't think. Okay, now, over to the Northern Territory. This story came from The Australian. Let me read the first line of this article. This Northern Territory housing executive is not talking about crooks and opportunists who too often find their way into Aboriginal organisations. Evans is talking about successive Northern Territory governments going about their work lawfully. It's just so inefficient. It is hard to argue with the premise. Northern Territory governments have built a massive public service of 24,000 full-time workers to administer Commonwealth dollars to 250,000 residents. Yeah, that's a pretty incredible ratio that they've got there. Look, what they're talking about is the bureaucracy that's involved in social and affordable housing in Northern Territory. Now, of course, there's definitely mention of Aboriginal tenants here. And it's funny, when you look into the nitty-gritty of these programs, a lot of the time, it is actually misappropriation of funds by public servants. And the more Aborigines that are working in it, well, the more and more misappropriation there is. But that's not the thrust of this article. This article is trying to say that as the new responsible party, who's now in government, the Country Liberal Party needs to sort of wind back the legacy of inefficient bureaucracy in the Northern Territory. Well, I certainly would agree that they need to sack a lot of people. That's, like I said, a ridiculous ratio. 24,000 full-time workers for 250,000 residents. Wow. So these are just, look, let's be honest, they're like, it's just free housing for Aborigines is really all it is. And yeah, they need to cut back on it, or at the very least, they need to push back on this idea that, like, if Aborigines wreck their house, the government should not come in and rebuild it. There was a case that essentially found that those in social housing in the Northern Territory had a right to a property in a good condition. And what does that mean, of course? Well, you can do whatever the fuck you want to the property. I've heard stories of Aborigines doing things like, eventually, like, the power is shut off because they don't pay their bills. And so when it gets cold, they go and they light a fire. And when they can't find wood, they'll actually take it from the roof of the house. And then they'll start taking it from the walls. And they'll slowly, like, start to strip this house away and burn various parts of it. And then they say, oh, look, the government's left me in this dilapidated mess. It's so racist that I'm living in these conditions, even though they're the ones who put themselves in those conditions. And they never paid for any of it. So, sorry, whoever wrote this article at The Australian. The problem is Aborigines, and the problem is not inefficiency. It's just that you're not going to get a return on your investment, if you could call it that. Not when you're dealing with people like that. Okay, now another story from The Australian, and we're still in the Northern Territory. The Aboriginal organisation paid to run Alice Springs town camps would share control of remote housing across the Northern Territory with land councils and other Indigenous bodies under an agreement struck by Labor. So the Alice Springs town camp contractor could move from providing services to the current landlord, which is the current government under the CLP, to being the landlord or one of the landlords through its membership of the peak body called Aboriginal Housing Northern Territory. The council has been under the spotlight in recent weeks amid community demands to know where $27 million in government grants last financial year had been spent, with reports of rubbish-strewn, rundown, and poorly maintained properties at many of the camps in Alice Springs. Consultants are finalising a strategy for the transfer of the Northern Territory's more than 5,000 remote houses to Aboriginal control as Indigenous leaders and organisations prepare to discuss at a two-day conference in Darwin the pressing issues that need to be addressed to take Aboriginal housing back into Aboriginal hands. Okay, so they're saying that I love this idea where it's like, let us run our own programs, our own housing. It's like, what, you mean the programs and the housing that the government pays for, that the taxpayer pays for? You know, it's like when they, we quarantined some of their welfare payments so that, a certain percentage of it had to be spent on essentials like groceries and rent. And they're like, how dare you tell us how we should spend our money? It's not your money, for God's sake. And no, you do not have the agency. You do not have the requisite responsibility and conscientiousness to run these programs. You don't. It's why we end up with Aboriginal families who just completely gut the house and then expect the government to pay for it. So no, all this shit, if you want to make it true ownership, if you want true autonomy, you pay for it. You pay for all of it. Don't go running to the white man for the handout. Don't expect him to pay for fucking everything. And then when we ask you to show some accountancy for it, you call us racist. No, fuck off. You don't get that. You're not getting it that way. Okay, on to industrial relations. So the Victorian branch of the Australian Education Union has reached an in-principle agreement that could settle a pay dispute between teachers and the state government. Teachers will receive a pay rise of between 28 and 32% over the coming 4 years, depending on their roles. So this is said to be a significant step towards the ending the wages standoff. So this has seen tens of thousands of teachers and other staff take part in the first statewide strike that Victoria had seen in 13 years. It was surprising because teachers are actually from one of the unions that is more likely to take industrial action. Doesn't always have to be a strike, of course, but teachers like to get a day off. They like encouraging students to take days off too for like climate change and stuff. Okay, now we have to talk about the CFMEU, of course. We're in the IR section. So a workplace health and safety Queensland employee has told the inquiry into the CFMEU in Queensland that they believe union members planted asbestos at the Cairns Performing Arts Centre on that construction site during bargaining negotiations. So the CFMEU had made social media posts attacking the credibility of those employees. I just cannot believe. No, I don't believe that. I'm sorry. I know that the CFMEU can do some dirty shit, and they do implement standover tactics, bullying, stuff like that. But the idea of planting asbestos, something that can kill you, if asbestos is found, like in a building that their members are working in, they do everything they can to get that site shut the fuck down until they get the asbestos out of there. And I mean, obviously, this is just complete hearsay as well. Where's the evidence? A lot of these people just hate the union. And sometimes I think it's because the union actually shows that they're not doing their job properly. Like I've said before, that when it comes to like occupational health and safety, like who hires those officers is quite critical, I think, because if the company hires them, well, that's a conflict of interest. If you work for a company, you're going to be a yes man for that company. I mean, that's your job. So if things are not safe, you're much more likely than, say, a union-appointed official. You're much more likely to say, no, it is safe, nothing wrong with it, job goes ahead. Now, I know obviously there's potential for bias in the other direction as well, but still, you have to err on the side of safety, I think. And something that the union always says is that these state bodies, so not just the officials that are hired by construction companies, but also the regulators such as WorkSafe or the Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. A lot of these places are just sort of underpaid bureaucrats who are also yes men. And that means that there is some bad blood between those regulators and the CFMEU. And to be honest, that sounds like shit they're just making up. Okay. So it's turned out that the CFMEU has hired a political polling firm to help rebuild the union's standing with members and the broader public. And they offered $90 payments to members who would take part in focus groups. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this email was circulated to members, and it said that they had engaged research company Redbridge Groups to, quote, help us prepare for the challenge and opportunities that lay ahead, including wages, safety, and the union's long-term direction. So it's understood that Redbridge was engaged in recent weeks and is canvassing the views of both members and the wider public as part of a strategy to rehabilitate the union's reputation. Yeah, I mean, ever since that 60 Minutes documentary that kind of forced John Setka to resign, and of course that spurred on the placing of the CFMEU into administration. Yeah, definitely fair to say that the CFMEU has not had the best public image as of late, and they want to rebuild it. And so they're paying their members $90 each to take part in these focus groups. I mean, it's usually companies, isn't it, who put together focus groups to better market their products. I guess you could say the union is sort of a business itself. Okay, let's move on to immigration. Now, just to come back to Angus Taylor's proposed policy to tie migration numbers with the pace of home building. in this country. Not a surprise that business groups have come out as a unified voice to keep net migration numbers unchanged. I think that's somewhat misleading. I think you'll find actually that they're united, business groups are united in wanting to increase immigration. But yes, of course, they would certainly oppose any effort by Angus Taylor or anyone else to drive numbers down. And look, this is primarily why I say that I'm skeptical of anything. I mean, for one thing, what's being proposed here is, if implemented, would be minimal. But secondly, I mean, you just have to ask, why is it that we do have massive amounts of migration in this country, even though most Australians don't want it? And it's because the two major political parties, or the uni party, are beholden to special interest groups. Both sides are enormously lobbied by business organisations. Labor also just has an interest in voters. Migrants, particularly non-whites, tend to vote Labor. And also, keeping property prices up is also in the interest of both parties. I mean, it tends to be old boomers who vote for the coalition. They don't want anyone to fuck with their portfolio. So high migration numbers are good for them. They're not affected by it. They live in their leafy suburbs where they are safely away from all of the diversity that they have brought in. And it's the younger generation who is going to have to wallow in the mess that they've created. Now, and then on the Labor side, they have a vested interest in this, because the higher property prices go up, the more and more people you push out of the property market and into rentals. And remember this, people who rent are much more likely to vote Labor. So they have a vested interest in it too. It's shit. And, that's why nothing changes. They're beholden to these groups. The only way something can change is if we have an authentic nationalist party, not like One Nation. I just saw that, like, one of the guys elected in South Australia is a faggot with an Indonesian Muslim boyfriend, for Christ's sake. He cried during his maiden speech and said, "I love migrants." Okay, so, we've been saying it for a while now, but you should know, forget about One Nation. No, we need an authentic nationalist voice that does not take money from the big corporations, from billionaires, from green groups, etc. We need a party that is primarily run through its membership and primarily funded through its membership. We don't have that right now. Hopefully we're not too far away from it. So the university sector, they're bracing for cuts because, look, they're the easiest group to go after. Foreign students are the easiest group to go after. And Labor did it temporarily. They slowed the rate of foreign students into this country by like a few percentage points, and but then they all came back this year. All right, like this year, this academic year of 2026, they just went right back to the old numbers again. These cuts to foreign students are only ever temporary. And I suspect it would be the same kind of thing here. If the coalition were to be elected in 2028, for the first year or so, you would have these kind of pitiful cuts to foreign students. And the next year, they'd just go back to normal again. And then Angus Taylor would go, "Oh, look, it was this massive reduction in immigration overall, even though we only did it for like one visa class over 1 year." Like, oh, look at this, we slashed numbers. I mean, even the Albanese government is saying like they slash numbers. They're, the number I actually keep hearing is 40%. Um, and there's two things wrong with that. One is that they're comparing it to post COVID levels, which we all agree was an anomaly, um, because it was seen to be sort of catch up migration for all the immigration that was blocked during the 2 years or so of COVID restrictions. But the other thing about it, it's not even 40%. They're great at doing the accountancy tricks because they don't count like they'll overcount the amount of departures. Is a favorite one of theirs. They'll go on about how actually all these people left the country, even though they didn't. Um, and by the way, yeah, the overall number that Angus Taylor has um, given, he says below 200,000. Now, yes, of course, we have had numbers much, much higher than that. Um, it's quite possible that in one financial year we took in well over 500,000 people. So this might seem like a very, very big improvement. But like I said, there we're talking about post COVID anomalies of migration. Uh, what you really need to do if you want a proper benchmark is to look at pre-COVID levels of migration in this country. And you know what they were around? 200,000. Okay. So effectively, all Angus Taylor would be doing is bringing us back to the pre COVID levels of migration that were already too high. I mean, it's not like all of this just suddenly happened. I mean, yes, of course, like post COVID, there was a definite spike in uh, migration and therefore housing prices, but they were going up and up and up before that as well. Okay. They were. We just got particularly hit hard after COVID. So, no, that number is actually not all that appealing. Okay, now Labor is implementing a 12-month pause on new private colleges and training organisations applying to offer courses to international students. So this suspension is to give regulators more time to address abuse of the student visa system within the sector. Um, So the federal government says that they are focused on bolstering the integrity of the international education system to help address concerns about migration rates. Yeah, so again, all they're doing is just going after foreign students. And you know, this is something that the public, you know, doesn't get so upset about because it's a um, everyone agrees that like big education earns too much money from all this crap. But also, everyone knows about the amount of foreign students who are over here not studying. They're here working, but they're here on a student visa and they're enrolled in a fake course. Or they get like some fake qualification from a fake educational institution, of which, yes, there are many that run in Australia. There's many more overseas, but we have them here too. So every now and then, Jason Clare announces something like this. Or, of course, there are foreign students he's happy to deport. Those who write essays for their political science unit that criticize Israel. He'll happily deport those. Okay, so, sorry, it was 17 welfare programs. I said 14 before, but it's 17 welfare programs that would be blocked from, sorry, that would be blocked for non citizens in Australia. So, here's what the ABC had to say on this. Uh, Critics say the proposal will unfairly target permanent migrants from China and India who are forced to give up citizenry in their home country to become Australian citizens. Economist Richard Holden says the coalition's plan to address bracket creep would be more effective at winning over voters than targeting migrants. Oh, for God's sake, they're not targeting migrants. Um, I mean, I love this narrative that the left have that like vested interest groups and big business vilify migrants to take the pressure off them because they're the ones who are wrecking the economy. Now, yes, of course, they are wrecking the economy through the importation of cheap labor. But the idea that they are like scapegoating migrants for that and demonizing migrants is absolute crap. I mean, I just went through a story before about how the business lobby is absolutely unanimously opposed to any cuts to migration. So here they are saying we need more migrants, we need more, and more. And then the left says you're demonizing migrants. What a load of horse shit. And fine, tackle bracket creep and all of this. But no, I mean, I don't have any problem with excluding them from these programs. And if it means a lot of them then make the decision not to take up Australian citizenry, well, they can piss off to where they came from. And that would incentivize them to piss off to where they came from. That's good. I see nothing wrong with that. Okay, so 6 Australian women, along with their children and grandchildren, look likely to leave a camp in Syria within days. So there are rumours that the Syrian government is wanting to move them on because now, obviously, we know about the other ISIS brides and their children who came into Australia. There is, unfortunately, nothing blocking them legally. They may well, of course, be arrested at the airport when they arrive for various terror-related charges. But yeah, it looks like we can't stop them. So we've got more on the way. And by the way, there was a story in the Australian, and I was actually really surprised by the way they worded this. But yeah, they had a story. Let me read the headline. Revealed, the retired Jewish lawyer who secretly orchestrated return of ISIS brides. Yes, that was actually published in the Australian yesterday. So the guy's name is Robert Van Alst. And even though there was some Arabic doctor who was considered to be instrumental in facilitating their return, this is the guy who the Australian actually refers to as the mastermind. And you know what's funny? This article is written by a journalist called Mohammed Al-Faraz. I am amazed that anyone with the name Mohammed could get a job at the Australian, but there you are. Okay. Yes. So, Labor has equated the political and social push for women-only spaces and legislating protections for biological sex with demonizing migrants. Okay, so this is obviously a reference to the Giggle and Tickle case. So you had this woman who created an app for women and women only to organize house sharing. Then you had some disgusting tranny who tried to use the app and was told, no, you can't because you're not a woman. That was taken to court. The tranny won. It was appealed, and the tranny won again. So, Angus Taylor has said, believe it or not, that he has vowed, actually, to amend Australia's Sex Discrimination Act to include a definition of biological sex, because the current act does not include a definition of what is a man and what is a woman. Now, remember, we've had this promise before. ScoMo promised this. They also promised to introduce a Religious Discrimination Act, and that never happened. Due to many things, but one of the big factors was, what they call the maverick backbenchers, often also referred to as the moderate liberals. I remember at least one of them was gay. Trent Zimmerman, I think, was one of them who opposed it all. So, they haven't kept this promise before. Why would they keep it now? Okay. Oh, so there's a Nationals MP who's also proposing a similar kind of bill. So bathrooms, female prisons, women-only apps, and women's shelters would be protected for biological women under a national MP's proposal to make sweeping amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act. So this is the Nationals MP, Alison Penfold. She is actually going to introduce a private member's bill to reinstate the legal definition of a woman. Good luck with that. That will go down in both houses. Sorry. All right. On to anti-Semitism and Israel and Gaza. So we talked before about Israel's new ambassador to Australia, whose name is Hillel Newman. He was on 7:30 the other night, and he was asked about activists who were on a flotilla, of course, trying to get into the Gaza Strip to distribute humanitarian aid and contain many Australians. He refused to apologise for the treatment of those activists who ended up then being detained in Israel. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen the footage that was actually put out by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the extremist minister, I guess you could call him. He's not from the Likud party. He's from some other really wacko Zionist party in Israel. And there was pictures of him going around taunting the activists. So they were doing things like pushing and shoving them around, assaulting them basically. He was waving the Israeli flag around, and they were getting them. They had them all handcuffed in cable ties, and they had them bent over, and they were blasting the Israeli national anthem at them. And Ben-Gvir was saying things like, "Welcome to Israel, we are the landlords," and all this kind of thing. Now, that footage got out. Now, that footage wasn't leaked. He put it out. Last time I checked, which I think was yesterday, that video is still on his Twitter. It's still there. And so, this really upsets the optics kikes when that happens. I mean, they've obviously got no problem with something like that going on, but you're not supposed to see it. Okay? Ben-Gvir isn't very smart with his optics. So, he is just such a pathetic, embittered person that he feels the need to kind of brag about treating people like this. And look, when Hillel Newman was interviewed on 7:30, he was just saying, well, look, I've condemned him, the government's condemned him, Netanyahu's condemned him, etc. That's all that matters. And he wouldn't issue an apology. He also said that none of them had been harmed. There's images of them being pushed and shoved around, for God's sake. It's on film. It's on the film that Itamar Ben-Gvir put out himself. There was also an interview with this guy called Chris O'Connor. His daughter was on that flotilla and was arrested. And he was saying that, not only was there physical abuse of those detained, but what's been referred to as sexual humiliation. And yeah, we've heard all sorts of things that the IDF are capable of, including the use of dogs. You know, there are sick people, and then they make up stories about rapes on October 7 that broke pelvic bones, stuff like that. So Israel has said that they fired non-lethal shots at two boats in an aid flotilla that was sailing towards Gaza. If by that they mean rubber bullets can kill you. So they said after over the past couple of days that they have intercepted 50 boats, detained hundreds of passengers, that includes 11 Australians. Oh, and by the way, Penny Wong actually made the point that Australia has personal sanctions on Itamar Ben-Gvir. And I saw that one of the Australian Jewish groups said that by saying that, Penny Wong had decided to strain the Israel Australia relationship even further by doing so. This is the one I'm referring to as the Australian Jewish Association, or the AJA. Okay. All right. So the Victorian Labor State Conference, they're set to split over the conflict in the Middle East. I think this conference may have actually happened today, so I apologise if this is a little dated. So they are going to be discussing things like the party's attitude towards Israel, the war in Iran, and anti-Semitism in Australia. Now, there are different positions being held. And, I do actually agree with the Murdoch press in that, there has been this shift within the Labor Party in terms of, many of them are now willing to take the side of Palestine. I don't deny that. But, in many other countries, that same shift is happening on the conservative right. I don't think it's really happening here in Australia because, like with most political trends, or just most trends definitely, most trends generally, we're just a little behind and it'll take some catching up. And, our kind of famous commentators on the mainstream right, none of them seem to be breaking away from the consensus in the same way that, say, Tucker Carlson has, or even Candace Owens in America. So yeah, it'll be interesting. We'll obviously have to bring you the update on this conference a bit later. But yeah, certainly the membership of Labor is much more likely to side with Palestine. And the leadership is, sort of in the other direction. But now we're seeing such an enormous amount of pressure from the membership and an increasing amount of MPs who have taken a pro-Palestinian stance that, that's going to be hard to keep under control for much longer. So that will be very interesting to see. Now, there was an interesting commentary piece in The Australian. I usually don't refer to these, but this one definitely caught my eye. But this one is about Chris Minns and how he is putting his plans to outlaw phrases such as globalize the intifada on hold. So we know that recently it was his protest laws were struck down. They were seen to be a violation of the implied right to political communication, and rightly so, I think. Since then, there has also been a challenge made against Queensland laws, because they have outlawed things like saying from the river to the sea. And so what Chris Minns is doing, he's actually waiting to see what the outcome of that court case is going to be. And I guess you would then assume that if those laws are struck down, then Chris Minns would either just junk the legislation altogether, or take his time to carefully craft it to get around the courts. But this article in The Australian says something very interesting, which is that the laws in Queensland definitely would not survive a High Court challenge. And this journalist is saying, like, oh, it's not because they shouldn't. He's basically in favor of it. He wants phrases like these to be banned. But the journalist's name is Chris Merritt, by the way. But he's saying that the way these laws were kind of rushed through, they're not court-proof. The legislation is a dud, in other words. And according to him, it basically is guaranteed to fail. So he's written this article, I guess, trying to persuade Chris Minns not to give up when these laws in Queensland are inevitably struck down. And, it's amazing, like, how much the Murdoch press supports these laws. Supports the hate speech laws, supports the prescribing of so-called hate groups, supports cracking down on protests, and even cracking down on the use of particular phrases that are actually quite innocuous. So look, no doubt Chris Minns will do what he can. And that it may actually get to the point where he doesn't believe that passing the laws would actually work. But he's going to do that after careful legal consideration. And yeah, it might come to the point where governments just give up on this kind of thing. I mean, certainly if we have our way come September, and we're able to successfully strike down the hate speech laws, that will be a massive, massive blow for governments around the country. Labor, Liberal, state, federal. It'll be a massive, massive blow. And I'm not a sports fan at all, but like events like these, like they're my grand finals. I love elections, but this will be the first time in so long where I'm going to feel like I've actually had a genuine victory in the system. If they're struck down. I think they will. I think we'll be successful come September. Okay, now, Islamophobia. Just a quick story here. The author of a report into Islamophobia, that is the Islamophobia envoy, Aftab Malik, he's spoken out against the federal government over concerns it has not responded since that report was handed down in September. And he has said that if the government continues to wait, they may be met with another Christchurch massacre. So I guess with all of the focus being on Bondi as of late, he doesn't want anyone to forget Christchurch. Now, look, he's just a whiny Arab as far as I'm concerned. I don't give a fuck. But, like, one thing I will say is that it is amazing just how quickly the government has moved in terms of doing anything that the Jewish lobby wants. It's not that they're not receptive to the Muslim lobby or to Arabs or, Middle Eastern pressure groups or whatever. In fact, many members of the Labour Party are of that demographic. It's just that Jews are so much more important in the pecking order. That's all. I mean, like I pointed out when the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism released its interim report, the government was doing a press conference on it only hours later and had already announced that they were going to implement every recommendation. And I mean, how carefully could they have actually considered that, considering they made that announcement on the morning that the report came out? You know, when they say jump, they say how high. Okay. Aboriginal news. So Albo has met with the family of Kumanjai Little Baby, as she is known in Alice Springs. He's saying that governments must do better. And he highlights that the Northern Territory government is responsible for managing town camps. Yeah, I've never heard so much conversation about the town camps in Alice Springs. And I love this narrative that they're pushing, where they're essentially blaming the Northern Territory government. There's this perception out there among the left that just the very idea of Aboriginal suffering in Northern Territory must be because of this government, that there's some sort of genocidal law and order government. No, these town camps have always been hellholes. Remote communities where you've got full-blooded Aborigines that are away from the cities, the suburbs, etc., and they're just kind of left to their own devices. I mean, what do you expect them to look like? They're hellholes. It's places where everyone sniffs petrol and smokes and drinks themselves to death, where every man bashes his woman. Basically, all kids are physically and sexually abused, and yes, many of them are even murdered. Yet we keep going on about how this needs to be there needs to be a strong government approach to all of this. Well, look, I mean, you can either throw them in jail or you can occupy them militarily and hold their hand through everything and monitor just about everything they do, which would cost God knows how much amount of money. That's really all you can do in that situation. Stop expecting Aboriginal people to behave to the same standards as the rest of us. It's not going to happen. And that's why the question of race is so important. If we continue to promote this delusion that we're all the same, that differences are only skin deep, and that we're all born with the same behavioral patterns and cognitive abilities, well, you're building a society based on lies at that point. Okay. So the National Commissioner for Indigenous Children has criticised the two people selected by the Northern Territory government to lead a review into its child protection system, saying they do not have the right expertise. The Northern Territory Child Protection Minister said on Wednesday the review would centre on the recent death of Kumanjai Little Baby. On the same day, the minister introduced changes to the Northern Territory's child protection legislation, which has also faced criticism from the Commissioner. So, look, obviously the CLP is responding then. There was really no need for them to do that. I mean, look, I got to point out, everyone's going on as if Kumanjai Little Baby is the first one. This happens all the fucking time. They've just decided to jump on this one, I guess, because they can exploit it like Trayvon Martin and that by releasing photos of the cute, innocent little helpless girl. And it's a way of pulling on the heartstrings of the public. I mean, you just imagine what that girl would have actually grown up to do later on. She probably would not have been a model citizen. But yeah, I hate the way that the CLP is now, they've got a knee-jerk response to it as well. And they're like, now we have to update the child protection legislation and also the way we implement child protection services. So this is probably going to mean that there's going to be a greater intervention now into these remote communities. But at the same time, they won't take the children into state care because they will be accused of performing another stolen generation. This happens all the time. And that's despite the fact, one of my favorite stats from all of this is that the amount of children who are taken by the state in modern Australia, in Australia 2026, is actually higher than what it was during the so-called stolen generations. And that's despite the fact that governments and bureaucrats are shit fucking scared of being accused of forcefully taking children as a way of robbing them of their Aboriginality and to slowly exterminate the Aboriginal race. That says all you need to know, I think, about just how dire the situation must be. The fact that bureaucrats are incredibly reluctant to actually take these children into state care, yet at the same time, they still actually do it at a higher rate than the so-called stolen generations. These communities are just hell on earth. Okay, so former child protection workers have spoken out about key issues in the sector and the government's proposed legislative changes following the death of Kumanjai Little Baby. So these workers say that the government's response to the case has been a knee-jerk reaction that risks causing harm in Aboriginal communities. Oh, look, I absolutely agree with that as a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, of course, if you announce legislative change within days of a particular event, that's a knee-jerk reaction right there. Legislation really needs more time to be crafted than that. As to whether or not it'll harm the Aboriginal community, I don't know. It'll harm the taxpayer because it's going to cost a shit ton of money, whatever it is they're doing. And will it cause them harm? Probably not. It'll cause them a loss of autonomy, if you call it that. But I don't know. If you implement a hard kind of stick approach, Aborigines would probably turn out better. My problem with that is that's not our fucking problem. Why should we be eternally carrying the white man's burden to improve the lot of these people? What you should do actually is continue to let them live in these remote communities, but take away all of the alcohol, the cigarettes, make it so that you can only use aviation fuel because that doesn't get you high when you sniff it, or the fuel known as Opal that BP made, specifically because of the problem of petrol sniffing in Australia. I think that's what we should do. All right, they can have their autonomy then, and they can go out and fend for themselves and gather witchetty grubs or whatever it is they do, and that would be true autonomy. They can even have large carve-outs of land. I don't mind doing that either. The only catch is you can't go asking for help from the white man after we've done that. Okay, last bit of A news. Here's another article from The Australian. So this one says, to read from the article, the serious problem inside Australia's child protection system is bureaucratic ineptitude and an absence of consequences for lazy, poor practice rather than the often blamed rule that Aboriginal children should be placed with family or kin. This is according to UNSW science professor Megan Davis. Now, they point out that Professor Davis is a cobble woman. Let me just have a look at this article, actually. I want to just see what this woman looks like. Oh, okay, no, she does look Aboriginal. She's enormously fat as well. So yeah, she's a cobble woman with a public law expert who has reviewed case files of more than 1,100 removed Aboriginal children for the New South Wales government. She says arguments about race and culture since the Anzac Day disappearance of Kuinjai little baby allow bureaucrats and politicians off the hook. Okay, so this is another article put out here by the Australian saying that, well, you know what the problem is? Too much government, too much bureaucracy, too many entitled, lazy public servants. That's got to be the problem. Now, I do agree with her that we should take pressure away from the rule about the Aboriginal children being placed with family or kin. As I've said before, if you criticise that rule, what you're essentially saying is that white Australian parents have a responsibility to raise Aboriginal children. Fuck that. So, okay, fine. I agree in that regard. But no, it's not a problem of bureaucracy either. It's that Aboriginal people can't be helped to help themselves. Okay? When the British came here in the 1700s, despite what many outlets will tell you, there was well under 500,000 Aborigines here. You asked me, there was only a few 100,000, and in Tasmania there was 2,000. They were constantly on the brink of extinction. Okay? In Tasmania, there's two reasons why they died out. Of course, because there's actually no such thing as a full-blooded Aborigine in Tasmania anymore. But one of the reasons was just diseases, of course. This always happened to Indigenous tribes introduced to diseases that they had no immunity for, and they died. But the other reason was because they sold off their women for, what were considered back then luxury items, things like clothing and bedding and grain. They would often, and by the way, I should make this point. Aboriginal society is matriarchal. Yes, they do smash around their women or whatever, but women are the ones who take key responsibility in the family. And in Tasmania, they were the gatherers. They were the ones who would collect the food from the shores and things like that. And so sometimes the Aboriginal men would actually just sell those women off as concubines or whatever. And it would be for a week's supply of food plus, goods like bedding. And the dumb Aboriginal didn't consider the future. He just thought, oh, look, that's awesome. I'll take that. And then, of course, once it's all gone, you're left with nothing. And then you don't have your woman there anymore to fend for the family. Well, what happens? You die. That's basically what happened in Tasmania. So no, it's not a problem of bureaucracy. There's plenty of other sectors of government where we don't complain about bureaucracy at all. How often does the coalition complain about the ineptitude of our intelligence services, for example? No one does that. So it can't be something that is just inherent in the public service. No. You've got to actually look at who the constituents are. Who are the beneficiaries of these services? Who do they work with? Who's the clientele? And usually they're people of extremely low agency who can't be helped to help themselves. Okay, on to crime. More than 140,000 illegal cigarettes have been seized and 6 stores ordered to close down days after Western Australia passed its new tobacco laws came into force. So these laws give the authorities power to close stores allegedly caught selling illicit tobacco and vapes for up to 90 days and place higher penalties on offenders. So the 6 stores include 4 in the Perth metro area and 2 in regional WA. And here was something I missed when I previously read about these laws. The health department website actually publishes the details of those businesses that they shut down. I'm not going to read them out, but like I'm looking at them now. Yeah, so you actually get named and shamed. The business name, the address, the suburb, and also the commencement of the closure and when the closure order ends. All of that is published on this website. Okay, now in Queensland, copper theft. This is costing Queensland councils millions of dollars a year. Yeah, because if you collect copper, even if it's just scrap, and you bring it to the yard, you can actually get a lot of money for it. It's not a new thing. I remember there was a construction site I worked on, and there was a guy who actually, the power went out one day, and it turned out it was some guy cutting into copper, and he almost electrocuted himself in the process. That was back when I first heard about this practice. It amazed me, but yeah, it does happen. Now, that's obviously tied to things like, well, the cost of living and homelessness and all that kind of stuff. As economic times get worse, people resort to more desperate ways of earning money, and that includes theft. But I love it in this article. It's from the ABC, of course. They say that there's another solution to this, and that's green technology. So they refer to these people. I'd never heard this before, but lighting advocates. I mean, I've heard of that in terms of like stopping crime. I mean, that's definitely something that's well founded. Is that the more brightly lit areas are, the less likely crime will occur there, because of course it makes crime more visible. But here they're talking about solar streetlights. And apparently they do not make use of copper. So, yeah, they're saying, look, the solution is, yeah, don't worry about why these people might be doing it. The fact that most of them are probably poverty-stricken. But instead, we just need to introduce solar streetlights and other green energy technology that doesn't make use of copper. And apparently that will solve the problem. Okay, now to the Northern Territory again. Their government has introduced changes to youth justice laws that would allow police to hold youths in watch houses for up to 48 hours and question them without an adult present. Now, look, I'm generally opposed to laws like this. I think it's bullshit that you can be held for no reason, even that if that's with youths. However, I would say it should be easier to charge them with a crime, though. Like for the police to be able to legally detain you, I think that there should be some kind of charge, and most of the time that is the way it is. You have to be charged with some kind of crime. I guess maybe it's a little different for kids because you could argue that, well, basically they have less rights than an adult. There are gradations of rights that you accumulate the older you get, and before the age of 18, you still haven't accumulated all of your legal rights. So I understand that side as well. So yeah, fine. Detain them, 48 hours. That's not too bad. But make sure you actually charge them with something first. Okay, and lastly, for crime, Australia will work with Mexican and Colombian law enforcers to target some of the world's biggest drug cartels. So this is a new regional response that we're actually doing in cooperation with the United States, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. because there is a surge of illicit drugs that are passing through the Pacific now. And yeah, we've done a few stories on these. There was like that boat where it was like the French Polynesian police invaded it, and they had like tons of cocaine, or a lot of it anyway. I remember it was like millions of dollars worth, and they actually just chucked it all in the ocean, and they didn't bother to arrest the people on there. But eventually, that boat put out a distress signal, and so Australian police arrested them after that. So yeah, I mean, this is continuing. Drugs are sort of harder nowadays. I mean, I'm certainly no advocate of smoking weed, but at least you can't overdose on weed. This kind of shit we're talking about is really hardcore, potent stuff that can kill you. And it's amazing how so many young people get into it because it's like promoted to them by the likes of Joe Rogan or Vice, something like that. Okay, guns. So, South Australian firearm retailers say they are operating in the red zone due to market uncertainty surrounding the state's stance on federal firearm laws. Yeah, we went through this either last episode or the one before regarding New South Wales. There's uncertainty out there about not only what the current laws are, but what they plan to do, because Bondi kind of threw everything in the air. And of course, there's recommendations in the Royal Commission interim report calling for tougher gun laws. And something interesting here is that when you look at laws where they reduce the amount of guns that you're legally allowed to own, like they did that here in WA a year or so ago, what people have been doing is they get their family members to obtain a gun license, and the surplus amount of guns that they have, in other words, like the guns when they have gone over their limit, they take those guns and give them to their family member or their friend to keep them, so that they don't actually have to get rid of those guns then, because they're shared between different people. There's been a big uptick in that. So, I mean, that's evidence to show that, like, these laws don't really take guns out of circulation. People just kind of think of other ways of getting around it. All right, climate and energy. So, yes, Tuvalu, the country of, I believe, only 11,000 people. This is a country that, like, most of us hadn't even heard of before. But they get a bit of coverage in the media because they're such a small island nation. And I mean, not just population-wise, but geographically as well. They're in Polynesia, in the Pacific, and they're said to be one of the countries at most risk of being submerged in water due to global warming and rising sea levels. So, it turns out that the entire population, oh yeah, and by the way, I just found the population amount, it's 10,643. But every one of them has made an application to move to Australia. So they like squeezing money out of Australia to fight climate change, just like many other Pacific Island nations do. They squeeze money out of us to pay for their fuel as well. We just gave $30 million to Fiji for that purpose. But the question has arisen as to, well, what happens to a country's people if they actually are fully submerged in water. This is an article from the ABC, of course, and essentially it says, well, there have to be other countries, or even just one country, who will take them in. And this article says, well, that should be Australia because of the strong diplomatic ties that we have with them, the aid that we give them. I think we also do things like we help train their police, things like that. And essentially says that we're looking at the very real prospect of taking in all of them. So let me just read this part of the article. It says, in 2023, Australia and Tuvalu signed the historic Philippine Union Treaty, a world-first climate, migration and economic security agreement allowing Tuvaluans to permanently relocate to Australia through a special visa pathway. Between 65 and 80% of Tuvaluans applied for the visa in its inaugural year in 2025. That's roughly 8,700 people of its estimated 10 to 13,000 eligible global population, making it one of the highest migration application rates on Earth. Yeah, well, 80%. Yeah, that would that sounds pretty high. So the first wave of visas were granted, 280 in total, and those people have started making their way to Australia. And there's one woman who is a nurse. Oh, sorry, no. But one woman from Tuvalu says, I wanted to stay. I don't want to leave. So it's funny, they're painting these people as not being very reluctant. They actually don't want to come to Australia. They want to stay. But they just have no choice because, they're all going to drown in the next year. And I mean, it's just nothing like that, is it? It's these people who live in a shithole. They live in a poverty-stricken country because it is full of people like themselves. And they create a broken-down shithole, and they want to leave that broken-down shithole. And so they come up with bullshit stories like, oh, okay, the rising sea levels, we're all going to drown. Other countries now have a moral responsibility to take us in. It's all propaganda. Okay, on to other climate news. So Chris Bowen, the energy minister, has quietly set up an office of the presidency in his department. And so the opposition is saying that this is showing Mr. Bowen's ego to be completely and utterly out of control. Yeah, I reckon. So he is the president of negotiations for the next conference of the parties, which is the world's top climate change summit under the United Nations. This is the one they're going to hold it in Turkey, even though originally it was supposed to go to Adelaide. So yeah, the Department of Climate Change and Energy organizational chart that was published this month showed the government had created a new office of the presidency under the International and Climate Negotiations Division. Oh my God. And, one of the things I'd say that, I do think separates the coalition in a positive way from Labor is energy policy. Look, the coalition is absolutely right that under Chris Bowen, power prices have gone up by 40% on average. And that's despite the fact that, remember, power prices were actually supposed to come down by $275 a year. Instead, we're actually paying almost double. But yeah, Bowen's ego, definitely out of control. And this is a guy who thinks that he should be prime minister, because when he first entered Parliament, a lot of people actually looked to Chris Bowen as like a up and coming future leader. Like the same way they did with like Paul Keating or Peter Costello. He was one of the young guns who had all this potential. And then, the one time he actually announced that he would be running for the leadership of the Labor Party, he actually backed out in the first week. Yeah, and I mean, because of his policy on franking credits and stuff like that, he just kind of shot himself in the foot. And yeah, there was a time where I kind of thought he'd be a potential leader, but yeah, not anymore. Okay, so the Liberals and One Nation have vowed to oppose legislation for the early repeal of a ban on fracking in South Australia's southeast. So the government is seeking to repeal a 10-year moratorium 2 years earlier than scheduled so that fracking can continue. This is interesting, isn't it? This is Labor actually wanting more fracking in South Australia, and the Libs and One Nation say no. And this is interesting because I have found that fracking is like that one form of resource gathering that I've noticed Conservatives have a problem with. Even though they might be fine with like drilling for oil and oil refineries and drilling for gas, all that, they have a problem with fracking. And I think one of the issues there is because very often it actually affects surrounding agricultural land. And, you can mess with the water table and things like that. This is where I really need Knowlesy on the show, isn't it, to explain things like that. But yeah, it's that one thing, part of energy policy where Conservatives are like, no, we don't really like that. Okay, so South Australia Power Networks will spend about $10 million to improve network reliability in regional areas and combat insulation pollution. About 10,000 insulators will be replaced over 33 power lines with 15 high-voltage automation switches to be installed. Why did I put that in the prep? That's a boring story. All right, last one on climate and energy. Natural disasters fueled by a failure to curb global warming will make their higher interest rates a permanent feature of Australia's economy, and that is according to Matt Keane, the government's climate change czar, also former treasurer of New South Wales, and the guy who said that the natural home of the Teals should be the Liberal Party, but it's not currently the Liberal Party because of the Liberal Party drifting to the extreme right. It's basically this guy's job to convince everyone that fighting climate change is actually in a nation's economic interest. They point out things like, natural disasters in the future will start occurring with such consistency that it will be damaging to the economy. And you may have to see things like inflation and high interest rates at permanently high levels. The one thing I say against that, and by the way, I'm actually not a climate change denier or global warming denier. I do acknowledge that the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere can affect global temperatures. Yes, carbon is obviously an essential part of nature, but there is such thing as having too much of it. But my response though is like, look, there's actually an easy way out of this. We can go to nuclear, of which we have thousands of years worth of power that is essentially untapped at the moment. But the other thing about this, like if we're specifically talking about natural disasters, is that, well, as economic growth continues And as technology continues to advance, well, we're actually creating ways of shielding ourselves from natural disasters all the time. If you look at like environmental related deaths, for example, people who die from the extreme heat or from the extreme cold, it goes down all the time. Why is that? Well, because more and more people have access to things like central heating and air conditioning. So it's technology and economic growth. God, I'm sounding like a libertarian, aren't I? But this is one thing I do agree with them on. If you make appliances like that more affordable, give more people access to them, including those from lower economic rungs, then you better insulate them from the dangers of natural disasters. And that's something I think that is far too often left out of the conversation. Okay, onto the environment, just one story. So, controversial new legislation has been passed in New South Wales. This allows the inundation of river adjacent private land for environmental water flows into the Murray Darling Basin. So the Labor government says that the legislation will allow water to flow into areas in need, such as the internationally protected Gorda wetlands. So yeah, I guess this is sort of like what I was saying with fracking. It affects surrounding agricultural land. So this is not something that we're all too crash hot on. So the opposition and independents have a big problem with that. We've got a new ambassador, a new United States ambassador to Australia. His name is David Bratt, a former Republican congressman. He says that his areas of focus will be critical minerals and commercial diplomacy, defense cooperation, and partnership in the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, that last one, you know what that is? That's like bribing Pacific Island nations to become military outposts of the empire so that we can offset the Chinese advancement in the Pacific. There's basically a race between the United States and China to like militarily colonize the Pacific. Okay, Stafford by-election. So this is in Queensland, state election, of course. This was triggered by the death of Jimmy Sullivan, who looks like he committed suicide. So Labor have won this. Their candidate, Luke Richmond, won. Now, very often in by-elections, some people say it's almost a rule that the government never wins by-elections. So that, of course, was the case here. But it's worth pointing out that there was still a massive swing to the coalition. Labor held on, but it was not a convincing victory. Certainly was not a landslide victory for them. And some people were saying that this would be a real test of Labor's Stephen Miles. He was the opposition leader. He was also briefly premier when Anastasia Palaszczuk stepped down. So it looks like his leadership is secure for now. To the Victorian Liberals. We're doing state party politics now. So the Liberal Party sent an email to suburban branches in Melbourne, falsely claiming one of its members had died. No, the member had resigned, actually. So, yeah, you would ordinarily put out an email saying, hey, your local member has resigned. But they got this wrong and said that he actually had died. So, John Turnell, he resigned after twice applying to a Liberal candidate, to be a Liberal candidate, and is now, guess what, considering defecting to One Nation. No wonder they wanted to say he was dead. To the Queensland Liberal National Party, the Australian Electoral Commission has referred the Olympics Minister Tim Mander to the AFP after it was revealed he had enrolled to vote at the address of a staff member. Yeah, we covered this at the time. So Tim Mander said he updated his details with the Queensland Electoral Commission when his circumstances changed. But the Commission says that there is an absence of compelling evidence to determine if Mr. Mander lived at the enrolled address. Because, yeah, you're supposed to actually live at the address that you have told the Electoral Commission that you live at. You'd think a member of Parliament would know that. So the Queensland Child Safety Minister, Amanda Cam, so she's the one who's involved in this current controversy because she engaged in an intramarital affair with another LNP minister. So she's under scrutiny further after she was forced to declare undisclosed shares in several companies linked to her late grandmother. So she had not declared her interest in shares in 3 family companies: Leatherbrook Pty Limited, McCarg Pty Limited, and SA and CD Cam Investments Pty Limited. And these are connected to her grandparents. She was denied any wrongdoing about the failure to disclose. And she said she would seek advice from the clerk. Here's what she said. I have sought further advice from the clerk today. The clerk has now stated what was not clear to him from the information and the conversation is my status as director and shareholder, as trustee and executor. Thus, in the declaration the clerk prepared for me, only the directorships were declared. The clerk has recommended for clarity that I amend my declaration by inserting and shares after the word directorships and in the declaration. All right, on to the Queensland Labor Party. So their leader, Stephen Miles, has apologised after it was recommended he be found in contempt over deliberately misleading the Queensland Parliament. So he was referred to an ethics committee last year after he alleged the Deputy Premier, Jared Baliji, deliberately misled Parliament by failing to declare a conflict of interest during the state election. So the Deputy Opposition Leader Cameron Dick and Shadow Industrial Relations Minister Grace, yes, that is her name, were also investigated but cleared by the committee. The federal ALP. So they've got a defector. This is the Tasmanian Senator Tammy Tyrrell. So she actually came from the Jackie Lambie network. Jackie Lambie network, I basically is a left of centre party. So it's not a big surprise that she jumped ship like this. But before that, after Jackie Lambie, though, she was an independent. Like most of these minor parties, once their members are actually elected, they end up leaving. It's not just One Nation that this happens to. It's like almost all of them. I think the Greens are like the only one who kind of have things under control in that regard. And even they still have their defectors. Just think of Lydia Thorpe. But yeah, she's defected, and it turns out that she had actually been courted by the Nationals as well. Yeah, so this often happens when you've got someone who is popular in the electorate, and apparently Tammy Tyrrell is. They suddenly go their own way, leave whatever party they were a part of, and then another party wants to swoop in, scoop them up. Um, and it was Labor who were lucky this time. Um, I remember one of their big recruits was Cheryl Kernow. That was back in the 90s. She was a member of the Australian Democrats, back when people still actually voted for the Democrats. And then she defected to Labor. And not only that, but she engaged in an affair with Gareth Evans, who used to be the Labor foreign minister. Okay, on to federal One Nation. We have two more defectors. So, former Liberal Senator Holly Hughes and former Liberal Vice President Tina McQueen. They are both former members of the Liberal Party, and they have defected to One Nation. So this was announced at a Saturday night ticketed meet and greet event for One Nation at the Blue Mountains pub. And, I heard some interesting commentary on this, which is that it seems like there's just going to be so many defections from the Liberal Party and from the National Party that One Nation will actually inevitably end up looking even more like the coalition. Now, look, if you ask me, that would actually happen without those defections, because One Nation already looks like a pale imitation of the coalition. They never used to, you know. There was a time where they genuinely opposed draconian speech laws. But remember, both Pauline Hanson and Malcolm Roberts supported the hate speech laws that we have now post Bondi. We've got homosexuals dating Indonesian Muslims and declaring their love for migrants now, who are representing One Nation. So I would say that this is actually more of a case where, because One Nation already reflects the coalition, it just makes sense for all of these, say, more disgruntled members of the Liberal Party and the National Party to jump ship. I mean, think of the case of Barnaby Joyce, who's probably the most high-profile defector. This was a man who was the leader of the National Party for years and also the Deputy Prime Minister of this country. All of a sudden then, under David Littleproud, he was relegated to the backbench and, was really struggling for relevancy. Well, how can you recreate yourself in a situation like that where you can defect to another party? And just think of the amount of media attention Barnaby has had since he announced his departure to One Nation. I mean, he was on Sky News a fair bit before, but he's on like every bloody day now. And now there's serious talk about him actually representing his electorate in the lower house, New England. They're talking about Pauline Hanson doing the same thing and running against Matt Kavanagh in Queensland, the new Nationals leader. So, yeah, I mean, is One Nation looking more and more like the coalition all the time? I'd say we got there a long time ago. All right, local government stories. So federal and state MPs have joined calls for a mayor in Melbourne's western suburbs to quit. Yeah, we went over this guy who's a Pajit called Preet Singh. He gave a character reference to a convicted pedophile. He is still refusing to resign, said that he's focused on the council's work. I think his days are numbered, though. In India, You'd probably get away with that. Not here. Not yet, anyway. Mark Latham. So, the independent MP Alex Greenwich has launched contempt proceedings against Mark Latham. So this came after Mark Latham made an attack on social media directed at the tribunal that found he had unlawfully vilified and sexually harassed Alex Greenwich. Greenwich's lawyers asked Latham to delete the post, which actually prompted Latham to just upload another comment. So yeah, I mean, when you attack the institution that found you guilty, I mean, you're allowed to obviously disagree with a decision and air that opinion publicly, but there are other lines you can cross, though, in terms of attacking the institution and being found in contempt of court. And that's what's going on right now. And remember, Latham's actually been found guilty in two different cases. It's all to do with the same tweet, though. And I think in like both cases, he was ordered to pay over $100,000. However, the combined legal bills of Alex Greenwich are over $500,000. So that is where that's really going to hurt. And as far as I know, I don't think Latham's actually like some high flyer. I think he owns a property in Western Sydney and that's it. So, you know, I really doubt his capacity to pay here. He's going to appeal both decisions, so he hasn't paid anything yet. Okay. Oh, wait. Another story on Mark Latham. So, there was a AVO, apprehended violence order. There was an application for one of these taken against Mark Latham by his former partner, Natalie Matthews. This is the one where, you know, he is said to have defecated on her during sex. And Mark Latham actually admits that. He actually submitted an affidavit where he said, yes, like he did shit on her, but that she wanted him to. And remember the tweet that Mark Latham put out there attacking Alex Greenwich was telling him he was disgusting because he stuck his dick in a bloke's ass and covered it in shit. Now, that's correct, of course. That is quite disgusting. But I'd say that shitting on someone as well, I think that's pretty disgusting too, Latham. Anyway, this application for the AVO lodged by Natalie Matthews was withdrawn. So neither Latham or Matthews actually turned up to court that day. They didn't have to. But Latham's lawyer, Zali Burrows, walked outside court, gave a brief statement saying that the withdrawal of the AVO application was a good result and there was no order as to costs. And when she was asked how Latham felt about this, she simply said, "You'll have to ask him." So we're not really sure why the application was withdrawn. Maybe it just had no basis. Because she does claim he was physically abusive towards her. Okay, so still a little bit of prep to go, guys. What have I got? 6 pages, but I'll try to get through this stuff a bit quickly. We are at the 2.5 hour mark. So political donations. The Allen government is working to devise new donation laws after the High Court last month found previous laws were unconstitutional. So that actually means that as of right now, there are no donation laws in place in Queensland. So that means there are no laws that ban foreign donations, no limit on donations, and no requirements to disclose them. So they would have actually been much more beneficial under the old system. But when they replaced them and those laws were found unconstitutional, all of a sudden you're left with an absence of laws, meaning it's a free-for-all at the moment. And remember, the election's in November. It's not all that far away. Okay, the property developer David Trask, he owns land in a special state development area. He bid $50,000 for a lunch with the Queensland Deputy Premier. So this comes only 2 months after the LNP relaxed an 8-year ban on developers making contributions to political parties. Yeah, this was a law that was passed by the Palaszczuk Labor government because, well, developers almost exclusively, or at least in Queensland, donate to the LNP. I mean, there's plenty of others in the business lobby, plenty of other big businesses who donate to Labor. But developers almost exclusively donate to the Libs. And, again, one of those reasons why the Libs won't do anything serious on housing or immigration, because developers don't want them to. Anyway, David Trask said that the donations ultimately do not mean anything except a goodwill gesture to the party. And any approvals would be made within the law. So what he's trying to say is, look, okay, I gave a donation, and yeah, that got me lunch with the Deputy Premier. But that doesn't mean I'm lobbying the government. It doesn't mean that I'm expecting something in return for my $50,000. Oh, no, it doesn't work like that, does it? Okay, freedom of information. Key government departments, including that of Prime Minister and Cabinet, are falling dramatically short of their legal obligations under the country's freedom of information standards. Now, there was a report recently released that found that nearly 80% of the FOI decisions were to refuse access to information in part or full. Yeah, so remember, you can make one of these freedom of information applications to have, I guess what you'd say, classified material publicly released. You can argue that it is in the public interest to do so. Now, you may remember that Labor were actually going to make this whole process much, much harder. So this is where they wanted to restrict access to that information. And they said it was actually a response to the high number of vexatious requests that people were making. Like people were making FOI requests that didn't have a leg to stand on or were excessive or something like that. Now, this, of course, was met with widespread condemnation. So Labor quickly junked that proposal. However, we're still in a situation, though, with a result that it sounds like we would have gotten had these laws actually passed. Because obviously the purpose of those laws would be to reduce the amount of applications that were successful. And well, now we're in a situation where 80% of those applications are successful. So something's going on here. It looks like, I guess maybe you could just call this a deep state element, but it's a deep state that is loyal to the Labor Party. And they're much more unlikely now to approve these FOI requests. Okay, on to disability. So, story from the Australian. This says that spending growth on the NDIS has ticked above 11% for the first time in more than a year, despite the efforts to rein in spending. So, data released at the NDIS's quarterly report on Friday showed that the scheme had jumped from 10.3% to 11.3% between the December 2025 and March 2026 quarters. Yeah. Look, that's not a big surprise because, well, despite what the Australians say here, Labor actually haven't really moved on these reforms at all yet. Remember when Mark Butler made the announcement of major reforms to the NDIS, he was talking about how it would take the form of numerous pieces of legislation that would be passed in the future. He essentially gave us a preview. Not much of it has actually been implemented. So much of the same programs and everything are just operating the way they used to. There were some limited reforms taken by Bill Shorten, where he got some of the more ridiculous spending out of those care packages. But yeah, there's so much more to go. So I think this article's a little unfair from the Australian to show that there's still been a small amount of growth in the NDIS. Well, of course, there's been very little changes made. Okay, so we all know about the plans to divert children with mild to moderate autism away from the NDIS and towards state programs. But there's also a program that's like a cooperation between the Commonwealth and the states known as the Thriving Kids Initiative. So this is showing that a $126 million investment would be made to set up an expanded comprehensive health assessment program. I guess this is to kind of be a little bit more stringent on eligibility, see if you really do qualify. There will also be $120 million put into a national autism information and advice helpline, and $20 million for a national communications campaign to raise awareness of the Thriving Kids services, and $61 million in workforce training. So I'm assuming that this kind of spending does not compare to the kind of spending that is needed on the NDIS for these kids with autism. So parents would be expected to play a more active role in the care of children no longer eligible for the NDIS, but they would still be supported through a new $100 million mental health and positive partnership program in primary schools. Okay, so they're really trying to put the message out there of like, okay, fine, they're not going to be eligible for the NDIS anymore, but that doesn't mean there aren't other avenues for them. And they're making this complaint about a lot of adults as well, saying it's unfair that they won't be supported by the NDIS anymore. I made the point at the time that so many people with autism. Sorry, Mike cut out there. So yeah, I was saying that a lot of adults who are beneficiaries of the NDIS because they have autism, many of them are actually perfectly functional. They have jobs. Okay, maybe there's some who are unable to work, and their autism is the cause of that. Well, can't they just get the disability support pension? That's something completely separate from the NDIS. The NDIS is like providing services to people with disability. It's not like welfare handouts. So if you want the disability support pension, you simply apply for that through Centrelink. I don't get why they would need that plus the programs from the NDIS. It seems very, very excessive to me. Okay. So Mark Butler has also defended the decision to bring more automated decisions into the NDIS. Now, everyone's thinking of robo-debt when they think of this. but yes, more automation, more AI um, is going to be used to kind of fast track many of these decisions to see if people are eligible, and then to see what their particular circumstances entitles them to. And he said, "Don't worry, we're all." He said, "Robodebt was front of mind, and that they're doing everything they can to avoid a repeat of that, and repeat, the kind of technological error that can occur." Now, here's an interesting one. 8 students in a typical classroom in Australia are now deemed to be disabled. So this exposes a surge in, I'm reading from the Australian, by the way, a surge in socio-emotional disorders, including mental illness, since the COVID pandemic. Okay, look, there's 2 things going on here. One is that, I guess, during COVID, there was increased awareness of mental illness, and that was because of the isolation that many people felt. People were locked down. Very often they couldn't go to work. They were even restricted in terms of seeing family members and things like that. So, and also you did actually start to see like suicides go up, SSRI prescriptions go up, um, and obviously, you also heard about like a shortage of mental health practitioners, things like that. That's all true. So look, I think yes, like these rates are going up, but it's like there's so many things in the mix here. So I'll read further from this article. It says the proportion of students classified as having a disability has jumped from 19.9% in 2019, the year before the lockdowns and school closures, to 27% last year. So a record 1,125,502 students received an educational adjustment, as it's known, due to disability last year. The Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority revealed these figures in updated school data. Schools do not need a medical diagnosis to define a student as disabled to qualify for extra funding through the federal government's disability loading. Yeah, so look, I think that mental illness is actually deteriorating in this country, and probably deteriorating in every Western country in the world. Part of that, yes, was due to COVID. We talk about long-term COVID. I think we should also talk about like the long-term impact that like 2 years of restrictions have had on us all. In many ways, we are still recovering from the pandemic. But then, of course, there's also the issue of increased awareness. When more people know about the different kinds of mental health issues that people have, there is a tendency then for diagnoses to go up. We all know about that. So yes, I do think that there's an increase in mental disorders generally in this country. But I would also say take it with a grain of salt, because of how much more likely we are nowadays to actually diagnose someone. Or in this case, remember, they don't actually need a medical diagnosis. The school just needs to make their own decision that this particular student has some kind of mental health problem. And look, other shit involved too. Too much screen time, kids not socializing enough, and increased diversity. When you don't have a homogeneous population, people find it harder to trust each other, to form friendships, to form community bonds and community cohesion, or what we like calling social cohesion now. all of those things deteriorate in a multicultural society. And yes, that definitely leads to mental health issues. Okay, so aged care. New figures show it takes 12 months on average to get a spot in aged care homes or secure at home support. Yeah. So there were plans to get many more home care packages going in the budget. So we'll wait and see what happens there. I think we need to massively increase the wages of aged care staff. I know they got a generous increase not too long ago, but I think they deserve more. And we should stop demonizing it as some kind of horrible job that no one would dare want to do, which is what Peter Malinauskas did in South Australia. He basically said, oh, us South Australians, we're too good to do a job like that. Fuck off. All right, so on to childcare. Property developers and investors have been linked to quality and safety failures in childcare centres, according to a New South Wales inquiry. The report found less profitable centres in remote and poorer suburbs were left as so-called childcare deserts. Yeah, property developers, investors, etc. Yeah, they care a lot less about these areas. They're not affluent. They don't bring them as much money. So why would they care? All right. There is going to be new legislation introduced into the South Australian upper house by the MP Sarah Game. Do you remember her? She was the first ever member of One Nation to be elected to the South Australian Parliament. And just like most, she defected, and she's an independent now. But you want to know what else? She's Jewish. But anyway, she's actually tried several times to reform the state's abortion laws. So previous attempts to change those laws have been defeated in the upper house. The latest bill, of course, will still be fiercely opposed by abortion rights campaigners. And the South Australian Abortion Action Coalition says it is extremely disappointed the issue is again before Parliament. But Sarah Game says she is hopeful, hopes to bring the bill to a vote before Parliament's winter break. So, yeah, she wants it be made harder. She wants to place new limits on abortions after 25 weeks. That is really, really milquetoast. You're talking about a fetus that is about 6 months old. We're not just talking about a clump of cells at that point. You're talking about a developed organism with a brain. I'm a dirty atheist, but, even I think that's a bit sick. Health. So the federal government has unveiled a $7.2 million package for more diphtheria vaccines. Now, this is a disease that was once considered almost completely eradicated, but there have been 230 cases reported this year. Now, part of this is because, look, this might not even be a disease that you've heard of before. It's not very well known. So I guess it's just one of those vaccines that people have neglected because of that reason. It's also because of vaccine hesitancy. That's another reason. So it's just, again, talking about COVID. COVID created a mass hysteria of vaccine hesitancy or just outright anti-vax attitudes. I was somewhat sympathetic at one point. I am no longer. You can hate me for that. But I actually really regret at the time, I was basically telling our listeners not to take the vaccine and all that. I regret that. I know a lot of you will hate me for saying that, but I have come to a different point of view, and I do believe that these kind of rightoid conspiratorial takes in our movement are harmful. And promoting vaccines hesitancy is an extremely irresponsible thing to do. You are telling people to dance with death at that point. Don't do it. If you've got children, make sure you get them vaxxed. Do it the safe way. You don't get all the vaccines at the same time, for example, but you should do it. Okay. Tech news. So the chief lawyer of Anthropic has flown into Australia this week for closed-door meetings with senior government officials. So there's been a few of these. Remember, the CEO was here not too long ago. So one of the items discussed is securing Australian access to the company's new model, Mythos, which has only been released to a few dozen, mostly US-based companies, over fears it will be used to conduct cyber attacks if it falls into the wrong hands. Anthropic says it plans to expand access globally, but has not committed to a time frame. Okay, a couple of quick infrastructure stories. So communities in the Blue Mountains and Central West New South Wales, they've suffered a dramatic drop in trade after a section of the Great Western Highway was closed unexpectedly more than 2 months ago. So the New South Wales government has announced $3.5 million in a support package to relieve the impact of the closure. Transport for New South Wales is deciding between two design solutions to reopen the highway at the Victoria Pass. A new report recommends abolishing laws that require developers to build car parking spaces in apartments. Yeah, so the Grattan Institute released a report that found that up to 40% of car parks were left empty each night in capital city apartments. Yeah, look, I've noticed this as well. Like when I have gone to visit friends who live in flats, they very often they'll tell me, "Oh, just park in this spot. No one ever parks there." I'm not supposed to actually park in the building, but there's always just so many vacant spots that you park there and you don't get caught. And one of the reasons for that is because many of the people who live in that block don't have a car. And that's actually one of the reasons why they've chosen to live in a city, so they can be like someone from New York. And all you have to do is just walk to the shops and walk to your work, and you basically never have to drive. And yeah, I mean, it is kind of infuriating when you see something like that. All these free spaces that no one is allowed to use, yet drive outside that building in the CBD and there's bloody no parks anywhere. So I definitely understand what they're getting at here. Peter Hollingworth is dead. Do you remember him? He was Governor General of this country. He was our official head of state, or second to the Queen, whatever, depending, or the King now, sorry, depending on your interpretation. But this is a guy who was an Anglican bishop, and he was actually accused of covering up sexual abuse in the Anglican Church. And I think it was Simon Crean at the time, who was the Labour leader, was condemning John Howard for supporting this man and appointing him in the first place. And a lot of people really didn't like this guy. There was an abuse survivor who said that he was a sad example of a man. I think I was pretty young when all this stuff. Well, no, I definitely was pretty young when all this stuff was out. I don't know if I paid that much close attention to it. I would really have to go back and examine this. I mean, I was critical of George Pell at one point. Then I started reading stuff about his case, and my mind completely changed. So who knows? Maybe it's the same deal with Peter Hollingworth. I'm really not sure. Okay, the last two stories are on statues. So there is going to be a bust of Scott Morrison, the 30th Prime Minister of this country. Oh, sorry, it's already been made. Yeah, I'm just looking at a picture of ScoMo standing next to the bust. Not sure what the price tag is on this, but the next story, this one is about Daniel Andrews. He's getting a statue built for him, and it is over $134,000. Oh, wow. I'm sure the Victorian taxpayer is thrilled to hear that. Okay, guys, we better leave it there. God, it's past 10 o'clock now. So, yeah, hope you enjoy that episode. Nolsey and I should be back in a week or so. Hopefully we get back to a more regular schedule. So thanks for listening. Check out all of our stuff at theracer.biz, and we will see you soon.